was exceptionally well done. Yeah. Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Dan Moulthrop, Chief Executive here and a proud member. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, our Chief Gong Ringer, Dr. Gary Langham, Vice President and Chief Scientist at the National Audubon Society. So, over the last century or so, thereabouts, the Earth's average temperature has increased about a degree in Fahrenheit, 1 degree Fahrenheit. This rise in temperature has had an observable effect on our environment and our lives. We often hear about shrinking glaciers, rising sea levels, intense heat waves, more intense storm events, in our case a brutal polar vortex or two. But what we don't hear as much about is the way in which climate change is affecting plants and animals, until now. The National Audubon Society recently released data on a 7-year investigation into the expected effects of climate change on the North American bird population. I'm not going to give away too much, no spoilers here about what Dr. Langham will be discussing, but what the Audubon Society and Dr. Langham and his team did discover will surprise you. Dr. Langham grew up in a birding family and started attending Audubon chapter meetings at the age of 7. His parents have apologized for turning him into a dork. No. He has spent most of his life watching and studying animals across the Americas and Australia. He now directs Audubon's wide-reaching scientific initiatives and studies, including innovative climate modeling, extensive avian research, and high-priority bird conservation. His work connects Audubon's extensive network of supporters by creating free digital citizen science avenues, authoring local and state-specific reports, and producing cutting-edge climate science to be leveraged by Audubon's policy advocates. Before joining the National Audubon Society, Langham served as the lead scientist for Audubon California for almost 5 years. He also taught ornithology at UC Berkeley, go Bears, and he completed postdoctoral research through a National Science Foundation grant at Berkeley funded by the Neotropical Grassland Conservancy. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in welcoming Dr. Gary Langham.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. Am I live now?
You're live.
Okay. So I wanted just to share a little bit about our climate report. And so you may have seen it. It came out last September. And, in the run-up to these things, you're never sure how it's going to go. But it had an unprecedented amount of media attention. We were all pleasantly surprised. So I think I did 40 interviews in the first 15 days. We were covered 3 times on NPR that week. We're in National Geographic. Now, again, in National Geographic, we were just talking about that at my table. We won one of the 2014 Breakthrough Awards from Popular Mechanics. I know. And I had the pleasure of going to the awards ceremony, and guess what they gave? This giant hammer. I'm not kidding. Really? No, really. So that was a real honor. It was in Wired magazine, and it was in 1,170 newspapers around the world, shockingly. All told, it had 2 billion, with a B, media impressions, which I'm told is quite something. So we were thrilled with the coverage, but maybe the most surprising thing was waking up one morning to find that it was 4 minutes on the Colbert Report. We had no idea, and so I never expected to be quoted on the Colbert Report. So that was a real treat. So let me tell you a little bit about the report and what we think it means and the call to action. So I always like to start with the other names on there. I get to be the front person and do events like this, but there are a lot of scientists who are listed there who have worked really hard on this, and I just want to acknowledge them. And that's just the science team. There are huge numbers of folks in communication and policy and others to make this happen. So it's certainly not just all about me, that's for sure. So we mentioned the polar vortex here in the introduction, and this is a map of the temperature last year on average for the year. It was the warmest year ever recorded in human history. But you could be forgiven for not thinking that was true because of that giant blue blob on the eastern half of the U.S. So the polar vortex made it appear like it was actually a cold year, but globally it was actually the warmest year on record. And sad to say, I understand that in April was the first time in at least 800,000 years that we exceeded 400 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere. So it's getting warmer. And we're the Audubon Society, right? So we care about birds passionately, and all those of us who are concerned about birds wonder how climate change is going to impact iconic species like the sandhill crane. I grew up in the Central Valley of California, where there's lots of tule fog not unlike what I saw here today this morning. And the sound of this bird calling in the fog actually, for me, is more than just a neat sound. It actually helps define fall at Cosumnes River Preserve. So birds have a way of transcending, it being more than just an animal, actually connecting people to a place. We're concerned about long-distance migrants like this western sandpiper. And that's a worm, by the way. It's not. It's tongue. Birds that are already of conservation concern, like this wonderful burrowing owl. How's climate going to affect the burrowing owl? Familiar backyard birds like this Anna's hummingbird. One of the birds I was able to identify at 7. Coastal species like American oystercatcher. And note that our study doesn't include really important ancillary things with climate change like sea level rise. So we're just going to be talking about how the species is going to be impacted from the species point of view. Sea level rise and other shifts are just going to come in and make it worse. Another migrant, the bobolink, goes to Argentina and back each year of the kind of the open ranch lands. One of the denizens of the eastern forest, the wood thrush, that familiar call could be something that for you all helps represent what it means to be where you are, your special place. Amazing birds like wood duck, summer tanager, another forest bird, rose-breasted grosbeak. How are all these neotropical migrants, how are they going to respond? And then another icon, the common loon. And so this is another good one that can, for the general public, be an excellent messenger about climate and really penetrate for folks. And of course, if you're from this part of the world, and especially from the land of 10,000 lakes, this actually helps define what it means to be a Minnesotan or someone from this region. So when we started this project almost 7 years ago, we thought, like, hey, wouldn't it be great if we had a Sibley guide, like your bird book, a Sibley guide to how birds are going to respond to climate change. And why is that useful? Well, if we had such a thing, we could just look it up and we could say, here's where the bird is now, and here's where we think the bird's going to be in the future. And that's helpful because we could then make smarter conservation decisions. We'd know which species were most at risk and which ones to focus on, and where we might make investments in the landscape to best protect the future of these birds. But we didn't have that when we started this, and there's at least 2 reasons why. This is really hard stuff. One reason is that the future is uncertain. We simply don't know how good a job we're going to do globally of curbing the cause of climate change, greenhouse gases. And that's important because over this next century, if we don't do a good job, we're going to see much more dire impacts than if we do a pretty good job or we do an okay job. And so the difference between business as usual and all persons on deck, all solutions at hand is pretty important for birds over the next century. But that creates a lot of complexity. That's one thing. And we can simplify it in a graph like this just to say that we could have a high emission future, a mid emission future, or a low emission future. So we want to look across those things both over time and severity. And then the other reason is what I call the web of life problem. And that's because we've just spent the last 80 or 90 years educating the public about how interconnected life is on the planet. And so even if we had perfect understanding, which we could never really have, of how one species might respond to climate, what about all the things it depends on? What about its habitat? What about its food? What about its predators? What about its competitors? Ecology is interconnected and complicated, and just knowing how, so then you think, if you just pull on one of those threads in that web, how do you not expect the whole thing to come down? So it's not just about the osprey, but about the fish it eats too. And if you can tell me what that fish is, please do, because so far all the audiences have let me down, but someone must know. It's such a handsome fish. All right, so ideally you might be thinking, well, models, that's nice. I prefer reality to models. Well, I do too, but when it comes to projecting the future, that's all we have is models. And so if you think of this picture of as representing reality, you can think of this illustration, the Sibley illustration, going back to our field guide idea, as an abstraction of that. And there's a reason why most field guides, almost all of them, have paintings instead of photographs. That's because you can better emphasize the field marks and the things you're trying to highlight than you can if you're just taking a picture. And so abstractions can serve a very useful purpose. And similarly, we can extend this to a mathematical abstraction. In the similar way, we're simplifying reality, and it can be powerful and help us too. And no, there's no quiz on what that is later. So what we did in trying to tackle this problem was a couple things. First of all, we realized, hey, we're the Audubon Society, and we have been collecting bird observations for 115 years now. How many people have ever participated on the Audubon Christmas bird count? That's what I like to see. And then for those of you who haven't raised your hand, there's always this coming year. But for 115 years, we have people like yourselves have volunteered their time to go out and see how the birds are doing and then put it all into a giant database so we can do cutting-edge modeling years later. I did my first count in 1978, and my father was a very competitive birder. That's how I got into it. So for us, it was about crushing the other people in the circle, and then it was fun to try to beat them at the potluck count-off later. It was very competitive, but it was still about community and a love of place, and for my father, about winning to some extent. But who would have guessed that all these years later, we're able to use some of that information collected to do some modeling that was not possible back then. So we have more bird observations than we could possibly use. And then we also, not only the Christmas bird count represented here on the right, see all those blue circles are the circles we have. And you'll notice that no one wants to go up to Nunavut in the middle of December. So there's a lot better coverage in the lower 48 than higher latitudes. And that does have implications for the modeling later. But still, the lower 48 are pretty well covered for the winter. And then on the left are the breeding bird surveys. So those were started in 1966, run by USGS, started by Chan Robbins, one of my conservation heroes. And again, you can see there's good coverage. So 2 times of the year, we have good observations. And then the climatologists, many of whom were federally funded, which turns out to be good, I'll tell you why in a second, had given us these 17 climatic variables, these layers at a very fine scale. And who cares about the variables? These are the things that are known to help define at a broad scale where species are, both plants and animals, on the landscape. So we had all these layers that the climatologist gave us for every month, well back before 1966. And what's important about that is we could then pair the observation with those variables to build our model. So why climatic variables? You think, well, it's all habitat, so who cares? But at a level higher than habitat is range maps, right, which are largely described or even determined in part by things like precipitation, temperature, and the seasonality of those variables. So it's not as if plants or animals are randomly distributed across the earth. You've got your desert species, which are highly adapted to functioning in a low water environment, handling the heat well, and you can't transfer those species to the Arctic or some different things. Everything about their physiology, genetics, everything about them is tuned to being successful there. And nature is so competitive, things have to be really good at what it is they do. And these things can all be described at the highest level by these variables. And so people often ask what they are. So here is a list of the precipitation variables, kind of what you would expect, the driest, wettest, warmest, how much rainfall across the year. And then similarly for temperature, the annual mean, the range, various other things. And this is all well and good, you might be thinking, but what does it all mean? I find that people find more intuitive this last one, minimum coldest month. So how many people do gardening? Okay, so for you all, if you're going to buy something on the internet to plant in your yard, what do you check? That's right, the hardiness zone, which is exactly the same thing as the minimum coldest temperature. And why do you do that? Because that's a lethal limit for plants, where if you make a mistake, you have no more plant, right, if you don't check. And so for birds, this tends to be sublethal, but it's still an important indication. So the USDA came out with these maps of hardiness zone, which helps illustrate the stuff. if you look on the left-hand lower side, the 1990 map shows the hardiness zones. And then by 2006, they had to update the map again. Why? Because the climate had already been changing. And it had already been getting warmer on average across the lower 48 between 1990 and 2006. They've also updated it again in 2014, but I don't have a map. So it's already getting warmer on average in the winter. And the top map is just a subtraction of the bottom two, which tells you a few things. One, the general pattern across the continent is what you would expect. It's kind of intuitive that that kind of light colored patch is no change. The salmon colored is one increase in hardiness zone, which is consistent with our idea that it's generally getting warmer in the winter. The hardiness zone has sort of gone up on average by a half a hardiness zone. But you may be able to see there are also some blue, some dark blue, and some dark red. So even though there's this intuitive continental pattern, there's also these local patterns which are not so intuitive and help underscore why we have to go back to the actual data. We can't just assume that all the animals are going to head towards the poles or go up in elevation. The details are more complicated than that. So we took all our observations, we combined them mathematically. We said, okay, computer, based on where I see this osprey in place and time, combine it with those 17 variables, do that thousands and thousands of times, and then build a relationship between where the bird is and where we should expect it to be, even though we don't have an observation. That's kind of the heart of so-called species distribution models. And the nice thing about that is you can, once you have that underlying relationship, you can project it onto any climate surface. So once we know how the osprey relates to the variables, I can project it on any map, which is nice because the map's a lot more intuitive than the equations, right? And I can then project onto any future climate surface how much change I should expect to see for each species. So that's what we did. And let me walk through a couple examples to give you a sense for how this can play out and what it can look like. So Loggerhead Shrike, and we were just talking about young children here at our table earlier and getting them involved in nature, which is so important. If you're trying to get a 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old boy or girl involved in birds or nature, tell them about the butcher bird. You know about this bird? So instead of having talons, it actually it sort of acts like a hawk or an owl, and it impales its prey onto barbed wire or thorns and then rips them apart. And it sounds gruesome, but I promise you it'll get the attention of that 7, 8, or 9-year-old. It's like, wow, that's impressive. So how's the Loggerhead Shrike modeled to do? So in each of these, the summer will be yellow and the blue will be in winter. The darker the color, the higher the likelihood that that climate will be suitable. And then the 2000 range will be outlined in a color, so it's easier for you to follow. So let's see how summer goes. So here's 2000 on the left, and then a high emission future by 2020 on the right. You see it's gotten a little bit yellower. And then by 2050, a little bit more. And then by 2080, it doesn't seem to have lost any ground, but it actually has potential to gain, right? Can you see that? So why is that? That seems strange. Well, the truth is that for some birds, they actually have potential to expand their range. And that is what we're finding for this species. It doesn't mean that it can capitalize on that, because all the things below the bioclimatic variables, like habitat and all the suitable web of life things, still have to be there. So just because the map shows it doesn't mean they will. It just means they can, and we could look for that. If you know a lot about shrikes, you also know that they have been declining kind of across their range over the last 40, 50 years. That has to do with pesticides and land use change and things like that. So I just say that because all the normal conservation issues like that are still on the table, are still just as important. This just tells us what its overall climatic potential might be should the conditions on the ground be right. So overall, things are looking pretty good for this bird, and if this were what we found for everything, I wouldn't be up here, right? Because we would just go back to our normal conservation issues and say, whew, we don't have to worry about climate change. So if you look at both seasons, here's a GIF where it ticks through the year 2000, 2020, 2050, and 2080 high emission, so you can get a sense for how, for this bird, actually climate isn't going to be the biggest threat. And that's important to know. Unfortunately, that isn't what we found for all the birds. So let me use the chestnut-collared longspur to illustrate two other general categories. So this is a happy grassland bird. And you can see on the right that summer range in yellow is exactly over something that's really important to the extractive industries right now. Anyone know what it is? It's the Bakken Shale where the fracking is. And then the winter is in blue on the left. So let's talk about winter first. So there's year 2000 projected range, and then a high emission future 2020. So it's already dissipating, moving northward and eastward. By 2050, a little bit more. And by 2080, it's almost entirely outside of its year 2000 modeled range and has dissipated and moved to a different part of the country. So this is more like the shifting we hear about in the media a lot, that when people say the species are going to move poleward or upward in elevation in response to a warming climate, which is true, but there's a lot of nuance. In this case, this kind of tracks that best of our three examples here. And as conservationists, we can say, well, what does that mean? What's hopeful about this is we can now say, well, we now know what to expect this bird to do, and birds are great because they're not like trees where they're going to have to grow from a seed in a new spot. They're going to fly around. They fly around a lot, and they can respond very quickly. We also have more than 100,000 people just at Audubon who volunteer their time every year to look at birds. It's not that hard to convince people to go out in the field. We can let the birds tell us if they're actually responding the way the model suggests. What we really have is a prediction here that can be tested just like any other science project. And we can also overlay habitat, ask, is there suitable grassland for this bird in the areas where it's projected to move? Is there anything we can do to help it along the way? Are things protected? There's a lot of proactive things we can do. We don't just have to hope for the best. We can actually start asking new questions. And another example, maybe most depressing, is the summertime. So again, year 2000 on the left. And just by 2020, you can already see that its climatic suitability has decreased quite a bit in the southern half of its range. Can you see that from the back? That's just in a few years. On purpose, we did 2020, so we'd have some near-term projections. We could go out and look and see, is this model right? I hope it's wrong, but if it's right, we want to know as soon as possible. 2050. And then by 2080, you can only see the outline, right? Remember, the outline is just to help you give a frame of reference. By 2080 in the summer, the model suggests that there will be almost 0% climatic suitability for chestnut-collared longspur. So, wow, you say, wait a minute, how is this grassland bird, how is that possible? Well, don't forget that we're talking about the interplay of the 17 different variables. And so what this is saying is the particular combination that's important for this bird simply doesn't exist in 2080 under a high emission future. So if we're right that this bird is dependent on those conditions to make a living, to do well in its physiology, to persist generation over generation, then what is the future likely for this bird? And I don't know the answer to that, but it's not a good thing. And ideally, we want to know how many species are in this category and how many in the shifting and how many in the stable, so we know which ones to focus on and take action where we can. So here's what it looks like when it's all put together. And one of the important things about having maps like this that are a lot like a range map is they're a lot more intuitive for the general public, in the same way that birds are a good messenger for us to the public, that make things local, that make things real, that take the abstraction away. It can be really helpful to get the word out. All right, so we have arguably three categories, I'll say, for how these different things can happen. If you think of that black circle up there as being a representative of current range, then you can have a future range that's either exactly the same or even expanding. And we'll say that is very similar to our Loggerhead Shrike example. Climate probably isn't the biggest thing here, though even for birds like this, which we might argue are in the safe zone, who knows what other species are going to come into their territory to either be their competitor or predator or cause issues. I guess they could also come in and be a prey item, so they'll do better. The disruption just makes it hard to project. But that's one category. The second one is like the winter time for the chestnut-collared longspur, that's shifting. And the third one is like the summertime for the longspur, contracting. So we were able to model 588 species in North America, most for both seasons, under 3 time frames, 2020, 2050, 2080, and year 2000, and under 3 different emission scenarios under each of those time frames. And so all told, we were able to put these things in these different categories so you don't have to look at the 100,000 layers and try to make sense of it all. How do we summarize across this so we can communicate to the public? So how do they do? All told, 274 of the 588 were in that stable category, same as the shrike. And for Ohio, we were able to model 350 species of your about, 420, I would say you would have here. So 156 of the 350 we were able to model in Ohio were stable. 188 across North America were in that shifting, and 109 for Ohio. And then 126, unfortunately, had at least one season in that great contraction category, including 85 that live here in Ohio. So all told, about 55% of the Ohio birds we were able to model are in that climate threatened or climate endangered category. All right, so how did the birds we talked about at the start of this, how did they do? So sandhill crane, climate threatened, meaning it's shifting. My money's on this bird because it's already responded very well to management practices and migrates a lot, so let's keep hope alive here. Some good news for the western sandpiper. This is a bird that often breeds in the Copper River Delta of Alaska. It moves southward to Puget Sound, Grays Harbor, San Francisco Bay, and then ultimately ends up in Panama Bay. And you may have heard there was recently an international victory where the government of Panama decided to declare off limits some of the development in Panama Bay, which is really going to help this bird. And the way they did it is they got the school children to write letters about the birds that they didn't want to lose in Panama Bay. And that's what got the attention of the government officials. But there's another point here is that we didn't model Panama Bay. So even though I'm saying this fell into the climate stable bucket, until I know how it does in the southern half of its range, I don't actually have a full picture, and I may be presenting too rosy a picture. So we need to know more. Burrowing owl already had enough conservation trouble. It's climate endangered. The drought that we're seeing across the West is not going to help that. A little bit of good news, the Anna's hummingbird appears to be stable. This was a surprise, American oyster catcher. So this bird occurs along the East Coast and all the way up to southern Baja California. So with that wide a range of occurrence, you would think that it can already cope with such a wide variety of climates that it wouldn't be sensitive, but in fact the model suggests that it is. And that underscores the need to not just use our naturalist intuition, which is often quite good, but actually to do a data-driven approach for which species we should be paying attention to. And then bobolink is climate threatened in its summer range. I don't have a picture, I don't think, here, but it moves from where it is right now, kind of over the heartland of the U.S. in the summer. By 2020, a little bit north, 2050 more. By 2080, its summer range climatically is going to be what is right now the Canadian boreal forest. And you might think that's not such a big deal, but how is this open range grassland bird going to feed its young, make a nest, do all the things it has to do to be successful in the boreal forest? And while I'm confident that this bird will be able to track its climate niche if it wants to, I mean, it flies to Argentina and back every year, right? It can certainly fly north further. It brings back that web of life problem, like what's the bird going to do when it gets there? Because the boreal forest, however it responds, is not going to be able to move as fast as the bird. That kind of gets us back to the mismatch. And then there's a 98% loss just for Ohio, projected. Similarly, for the wood thrush, also climate threatened. For Ohio, 84% loss for the state, projected. And this is the wood thrush map, so you can see. And again, you know, it's interesting to look at a map because it compresses so much information, but maybe its most valuable thing, though, is getting us to ask new questions. I'm sure you already have questions about why this bird and not that bird. How's that possible? What does it mean? What can I do? It's the power of maps and the power of birds to get those conversations started. Wood duck is another interesting thing. So while overall it's climate threatened, it's showing a 113% increase in the wintertime in Ohio, but a 48% loss in the summer or breeding season. For summer tanager, actually a huge increase potentially. So climate stable and then potentially 1,000% increase. That's only meaningful depending on how big a chunk it started with because it's relative, but still 1,000%. Some things are going to be expanding and moving around or at least trying. Rose-breasted grosbeak, climate threatened, and again in Ohio, 96% projected loss by 2080. I think I have a map of this one, yeah. You can see it's pretty good in Ohio up until 2080. So, am I saying rose-breasted grosbeak is definitely going to do this? No. I'm saying that the model suggests that the climatic conditions it depends on now are going to shift in this way if we don't stop climate change, if we don't slow it down. But back to the optimistic part, because that's important in these talks, maybe this bird has more plasticity in its genetics, in its behavior, in its physiology than is reflected in the model. That is definitely possible, and I hope it's true for all the birds. I don't think we should rely on that because I don't think it could be for all of them, but I do think there'll be some tricks up the sleeves of some of these birds. And the way we're doing the modeling is a moving target. It's a rapidly evolving field. It may be that as we learn more with your help about how birds are responding, that maybe it's not so dire. But I'll argue that we can't afford to take that chance, that we still need to take action to save the future of the birds. All right, how about the loon? An increase in the winter, but a modest to severe decrease in the summertime. And then for Minnesotans, it's even worse. For Minnesotans, the land of 10,000 lakes, by 2080, the model suggests that the bird won't be in Minnesota in the summertime. And when you tell people from Minnesota that, they respond viscerally because the idea that they can't share with their kids or grandkids the tremulo of the loon while out on the lakes, part of what their heritage means to them, that's more than just a bird at stake. That's a way of life, and that gets us all reflecting on, if you think half the birds are at risk but nothing else will be, then you don't realize how interconnected everything is. It can't be that all these birds are going to shift without all the plants and animals, all the things we rely on for economics and recreation, the things that make us call the place where we're from home, that all those things aren't at risk of disruption too. So the bad news is, all told, of the 588 species, we found that 314 were either climate endangered or threatened for one of the two seasons, a little over half. And to put that in a little context, only about 9 birds are known to have gone extinct in the same study region since the industrial age. And I think that's meaningful in a couple ways, that 9 compared to 314, if a sizable fraction of those went extinct, like perhaps the chestnut-collared Longspur, that if you think about what's happened in the last 200, 250 years, what have we done to the landscape? Decimated it? Yet we have entirely transformed the landscape, haven't we, for our own ends, for agriculture, for living. And despite all that insult to all the birds and all the landscapes, still only about 9 birds in the lower 48 and Canada. So all this was what motivated Audubon to say, we can no longer, we can't do a report like this and then stay quiet about climate. And even though there's all the traditional conservation things to still worry about that are still equally valid, I mean, of course, we still care about our important bird area program. We still have to stand up and raise our voice, talk with our friends and neighbors, do what we can in our own lives, and collectively, both at the state and federal level and at the global level too, to reduce the cause and do what we can to pave the way for the future of these birds. This, of course, could be renewable energy like solar, making sure that we're transitioning from fossil fuels as quickly as possible. And in many ways, you could argue that all we're doing is saving ourselves money. If we could just get rooftop solar on all our houses and save ourselves some money, can we at least get ourselves to save ourselves some money? It should be pretty easy. And it may mean that we have to go to rallies and get the attention of our elected officials. Many of you may not be comfortable calling your elected officials, but I have learned in my 8 years at Audubon how important it is if someone from their district, a real citizen like you all, calls their elected representative and says, what's your plan to save the future of birds? What's your plan to solve climate change? To call them, you don't have to have the answer. You don't have to have the answer. That's what we elect people to have solutions for us, right? You just have to call them and say, what is your plan? And if you don't have one, you don't represent me. It's not okay that half the birds might go extinct this century. There are also more familiar proactive things that we can do. We can keep doing citizen science. We can keep going out and doing counts. After all, we now have all these maps which give us predictions of where the birds are going to move. And we can just go out and see which ones are responding faster, slower. We could be transparent about it, and we can just go out and watch birds. They're going to be an excellent source of information for us, an excellent representative of how the overall planet is going to go. As the birds go, so will everything else. Later this year, I'm hoping to roll out some pilot projects. We're internally calling Climate Watch. I'm sure we'll rebrand it to give you an opportunity to say, here's where we think the birds are going to leave, here's where they're going to go, and you'll have a chance to participate. We were also able to say, hey, here's where the birds are now, and no matter what model we used, the birds are still supposed to be there. So isn't that where we should put our conservation dollars if we can? So we did something called Strongholds, where we take the suitability maps of the current and the future, we combine them across all the time frames and all the emissions. We also looked at their biological response and said, here's where the birds are now, and here's where they're going to be in the future. And we're sharing these with state agencies and federal agencies to help inform our landscape-level decision-making processes. And we can do this across all 314 species at once to say the darker the color there, the more valuable that pixel is likely to be for the birds most at risk. Or we can do it for a single species. We can zoom in on a state like Ohio across all 314. So the darker the color here, the more valuable it is for the 314. It looks different if you just do one. We can overlay things like our existing important bird areas. And then we can rank them to see their strongholds value. Doesn't mean that none of them are valuable, but just we can say how likely are they to be valuable through the end of the century for the birds that are most at risk. So if you're a conservative in terms of conservation investment, you might say, this is a good bet. It's where the birds are now and where all the models suggest they'll be in the future. You really can't go wrong. We also pushed that information through all the publicly held lands in the United States. And this is just one example. We found a place I'd never heard of. It's called Fort Bliss. It's near El Paso, Texas. And one of the parcels that they are responsible for is 587,000 acres of beautiful Chihuahuan grasslands that happens to be in the top tier of climate strongholds in the country. But we haven't told them yet that they have responsibility for this really important place. The military is excellent conservation partners. I don't know if you know this or not. I've had the privilege of working with them, and there's two reasons why. One is that they're very, very, very good at keeping people off their property, of course. The other thing is that the base commanders, in my experience, are highly competitive, kind of like my father. And if you tell them that this base has more birds than the other base, then that they're kind of losing, then they want to know how I can get more birds than the other base. And so you can co-opt that competitive nature for the benefit of birds. And we found more than 50 places that are publicly held that have a relatively low protection status that are in the top tier of strongholds that are each is bigger than 500,000 acres. So I don't want you to walk away thinking this is all doom and gloom. I think there's actually lots that we can do across lots of parts of our lives. And it's useful to remind ourselves that at least as Audubon and as part of the green groups in general, we've done this before. So Audubon was founded 110 years ago by concerned citizens who rallied together to save the plume-bearing birds where they were being used for ladies' hats. They got together and they stopped that. And then 2012 was the 50th anniversary of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. And again, that book helped launch folks to get together, raise their voice. We got rid of DDT and a lot of other things, and the birds responded. Brown pelican, peregrine falcon, bald eagle, They were doing terrible 50 years ago, and now they have come back. So we've done this before. Little things matter. You might think that if you don't have a global solution, you shouldn't do anything, but what you plant in your yard, in your community, who you talk to your neighbors, all this is additive, and it all is important. This is my 7-year-old daughter, Phoebe, and it's also personal. It's personal to me, and I think it should be to you. And I think getting myself out of the science brain and into being a good parent and thinking that everything I showed you is going to play out in the lifetime of a 7-year-old. So if you know a young person, a child, a grandchild of that age, and think about this as not some faraway thing that isn't important, but actually, I'll argue, our moral responsibility to take what action we can, where we can, for the benefit of the people that we care about and the places we care about. And we're also not alone. That just with Audubon, there is a national organization, there are state-level organizations, and there are lots of chapters and good partners. So just Ohio alone has, 17 Audubon chapters, and I think, 2 right here in this, is that right? I think there are 2 right here in the city. So there are lots of like-minded folks who care about nature and birds in the future, and if we can just rally together and take advantage of the fact that we have this multi-layered organization, I think we can do a lot. Now, of course, Audubon can't do it all by itself. It's going to require cooperating and collaborating with Nature Conservancy and all the different groups. Anyone who cares about the future of birds, we want to partner with. So that's the end. But I just want to end by saying that I think what's important is that we all take action where we can in our sphere of control and be willing to talk about it with our friends, be willing to bird with a purpose, make sure our lists are going into citizen science, and talk to our representatives and making sure that we're making smart decisions that will help protect the future of birds. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You can sit down for a second. Today at the City Club, we're enjoying a forum featuring Dr. Gary Langham, Vice President and Chief Scientist at the National Audubon Society. We're going to get to our Q&A in a moment. We encourage you to organize your questions now and ask that your questions be brief and to the point. Be sure to tune in to our Friday forums on 90.3 WCPN, WVIZ PBS, 104.9 WCLV Idea Stream, that's our primary media partner, or one of the many other radio stations across the region and country that carry City Club programs. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Be sure to join us on Thursday, May 28th, for a conversation with Ohio Budget Director Tim Keene. For more information about our upcoming and past forums, you're invited to visit us online at cityclub.org. Today we welcome guests at tables hosted by the Canton Audubon Society and the National Audubon Society. Thank you very much for your support. And now it's time for our traditional City Club Q&A. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests, and we ask, and holding our microphone today is our Marketing and Outreach Specialist, Kirsten Pianka.
Question is, as a scientist, are you working on this with people all over the world? And secondly, just a brief statement, I used to work for Congressman Kucinich, and we loved getting phone calls from our constituents, so don't be afraid to call your representative.
Yes, that's a great point. Please do call your representative. I have been pleasantly surprised that they actually do want to hear from people in their districts. Is that right? So we are working with our BirdLife colleagues. Audubon is the BirdLife representative in the United States. But many of the countries that have a bird program like Audubon, they kind of group together with BirdLife, and we are looking right now to do a global study with them where we can bring the results for how birds are going to respond across the whole world to COP21 in Paris in December, where all the countries are getting together, and we need to encourage them to sign up for reducing greenhouse gases across the country, across the planet.
Dr. Langham, I appreciate you being here today. My name's Eric. I work for the Lake Erie Energy Development Corporation, or LEEDCO, working on the offshore wind project in Lake Erie. And my question is, I'm glad to see that you mentioned solar as a potential option for reducing our emissions. We know here in Ohio, still 70% of our electricity comes from coal-fired power plants. Solar can be a big part of the solution, but if we're going to replace the current status quo where we're so carbon dependent, I think that wind energy is going to have to be a really important part of that. So can you talk a little bit about how National Audubon Society sort of reconciles wind energy and some of the potential impacts on birds with mitigating the threat of climate change?
Sure, yes. Thank you for bringing that up. Audubon is very in favor of renewables when properly placed. Of course, we want to make sure that we don't put them in an area that are going to disrupt or kill birds. So trying to find that balance is important, and a conversation that we all have to have together. It means appropriate siting is key. We need to be investigating all kinds of options, and I think not setting any limits for ourselves. Like, really, why can't we have solar on every rooftop in the U.S.? What is actually keeping that from happening? Is there something we can do? Are there other safe alternatives on the renewable front that can help us reduce our greenhouse gas footprint faster? As with many conversations with climate, there's no simple, straightforward answer. What's vitally important is that we be willing to talk about it, and that we do it with a genuine interest in saving the future of birds and keeping better communities for ourselves and for our families.
Dr. Langham, could you say a few words about how the backyard bird count, the Great Backyard Bird Count with Cornell is meshing with the data that we've already been collecting for years on the Christmas bird count? Yes, so the Great Backyard Bird Count is now, as of about 3 years ago, all the information goes right into eBird. eBird, you may know, is mainly run by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, but was actually founded in partnership with Audubon about 17 years ago. We did that collaboratively. And then about 3 years ago, the reason the Great Backyard Bird Count was different for many years is it was the proof of concept for eBird. 17 years ago, we didn't know whether people would actually enter information online or not. No one knew. And so they started the Great Backyard Bird Count in that database to see if it as a proof of concept, right? And but then for years, they let eBird and Great Backyard Bird Count be parallel databases. They've since merged them, which made it instantly global because eBird was global. The good news is that now anything that goes into eBird has a really good chance of winding up in studies like the one I've just told you. As we're working on the 2.0 version of this, that'll be 1 kilometer resolution, so 100 times finer resolution than what I showed you, having the latest and greatest on modeling techniques and things like that. We're going to be using eBird information. So you can't go wrong if you're doing complete checklists in eBird. There's a very high likelihood it will be useful for scientific experiments like this one.
In the paper a few weeks ago, there was an op-ed by the head of the National Trust for Public Lands about legislation in Washington relating to the desire of a lot of Republicans to reduce our federal government's ownership of public lands. Is that something you're concerned about and or acting upon? And also, my family's from Wisconsin and are upset with Scott Walker's decision to make sandhill cranes available for hunting and calling them what did he call them? The chicken of the sky? No, I can't remember. Something like steaks of the sky, or I don't know, something like that. But I'm
glad I missed that because
Okay.
I already mentioned that it defined fall for me from where I grew up. So that, of course, I wouldn't call them that. I think in terms of the turning over public lands thing, that could be vitally important when it comes to military bases if we're going to start reducing those. I'm certainly not an expert on that, but I will say one of the values of the Strongholds analysis is it gives us places we should focus on if that starts to happen. And some have suggested we should have a two-pronged approach where if they do sell them off, that they have to be under conservation easement if they're a stronghold, and that we need to be very on top of those changes. In some ways, it's most important from the bird perspective that the land is being managed and curated to their advantage now and in the future, rather than the ownership. But that switch in ownership obviously could create dozens and dozens of owners and make that harder. So thank you for your question.
I'm wondering if Audubon has considered any type of a role in land use. You'd mentioned land use as a critical component. I totally agree with that. And that's my background is as a land use planner. And the state of land use planning in this country, in my view, is abysmal because it's so fragmented. And that coupled with the lack of emphasis on non-fossil fuels, fracking as an example, and all of the byproducts that come from that, and now we have these ponds that could appear from the sky, attractive to birds, ponds of toxic waste. Do you see a role for Audubon, or are you optimistic about trying to get some kind of unified plan, approach to land use?
Yeah, great question. I don't want to overstate what I think Audubon as one organization can do, but I think collectively the conservation-minded groups could do a lot. And one of the reasons we're very proud of the Strongholds work that I showed you, which is published in Ecological Applications right now, is we think it will help people make smart decisions. And now the challenge we're exploring is how do you export all those layers in an efficient way so that the land managers, people making decisions, can use them. We've been talking with state agencies in Texas, in New York, in Minnesota, in Washington State, and they're very eager to have some of our information. At the same time, we're also talking with the Federal Refuge System and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service about getting all our information into the national databases that will make it possible to make smarter decisions. I also want to recognize that in some ways, if it wasn't such a dire topic, it would be really fascinating science, right? Because in that way of thinking of it, we're right on the cusp of this giant global experiment about how organisms relate to their environment and how much plasticity they really have. And so while it's good enough to have what I've shown you so far, we're going to keep refreshing the information and staying on the leading edge and making it available to land planners and others. Thank you.
So I'm sure you have a list of climate change deniers in Washington. What is and I know they're not scientists and they don't really care, but do you have personal relationships? I mean, do you have lobbyists who are going to speak to these people? I think your idea of the states they come from and how birds have impacted their childhoods and their grandchildren is compelling because it's an emotional component. What are you doing in terms of those kinds of lobbying?
Yeah, great question. So we have focused on keeping this genuine to Audubon, right? We care about birds, so of course we care about how they're going to do in this century. We think birds are excellent messengers. They're apolitical, and they have a chance. They have a chance to resonate with people at a local level. So it's not just about polar bears and faraway places that people don't seem to care about that much. Of course, they care about polar bears, but it's not their backyard, and it's too distant. In terms of the kind of denier thing, one of the studies that we did with Yale was we replicated their Yale Six America study for our Audubon membership because we were curious, like how many of our own members, which are incidentally are 40% Republican and independent in Audubon, which is good. We're very proud of that. How many of them are interested in climate? And we found that 83% of our members were ready to be activated before we even shared the report. 83% were in the alarmed or concerned category. And rightly or wrongly, we have decided let's just forget about those 5% or 3% of the people who seem to ignore science. And let's focus on activating the people who understand what's at stake here. And that's really all we have to do. I think we don't need to burden ourselves individually with trying to convince that really hardened minority. Instead, we just need to be comfortable talking about it with our friends and neighbors, saying it's not okay, being involved. And I think a lot of good can come of that. The social science, which I'm learning a lot more about, is very clear that if you take some small action in your life, in your daily life, you're much more likely to take another action and another. And the more you talk about it, the more your network of friends and neighbors, it just becomes a normalized thing and not something that feels so polarizing. So the more we can just talk about it and incorporate it in our daily lives, a lot of good can happen just from that.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
I am a member of the Shade Tree Commission of the small village of Bracknell, which is a lakefront community just east of downtown Cleveland. Could you comment on what, if any, particular species of trees are more helpful to birds than others?
Yeah, that's a great question. So broadening it even a little bit more, planting locally collected native plants, whether they're trees or shrubs or whatnot, is hugely important for birds and the insects and all the things they depend on. So you can't go wrong if you're planting native plants in your yards and your communities. And I love the idea of the shade tree thing. And so we would just suggest that you work with the local horticultural groups to make sure that they're as local as possible, ethically resourced and things like that, and representative of that region. And one of the nice things about doing that in your yards, and they're finding this out in the West, is they tend to be more drought tolerant. They tend to require less spraying and less maintenance overall, all of which just make things cheaper and have knock-on effects to the things that birds depend on. If you think about hummingbirds, for example, increasingly we're encouraging members to try to plant in their yards for their whole life cycle for the hummingbirds. So yes, it's good enough to put up a feeder, and I think you should, but if you could also plant native plants that produce the insects they need to feed their young, they don't just use nectar. Hummingbirds need insects, they need that protein. And if you can plant trees where they can build a nest, and something that will create the lichens they can line their nest and the spider webs, if you can think about full life cycle gardening for your hummingbird, you can really service them in a way that will help not only the hummingbirds but all the other things that will benefit from those plantings. Thank you.
My brain is full. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've been enjoying a wonderful forum featuring Dr. Gary Langham, Chief Scientist at the National Audubon Society. Thank you all very much for joining us. Our forum is now adjourned.